Good. So, welcome back again. I see a lot of new faces now in the audience. Welcome to this very special part of a very special conference. But before we start with the session proper, I feel we need to thank in the first place the two ladies in the back who have been translating relentlessly since this morning, and I hear faultlessly so in both languages, which made at least a part of the communication and exchange faultless, smooth, and effortless. I would like to thank Mireille Hamouche and Talan James for doing a wonderful job. And I hear they will be with us for the rest of the conference, so thank you very much to this office. Now, when you were thinking of preparing with Haris, Harut, Aziz, and myself this conference and thought, what kind of keynote do we want to have? There are so many a topic which would deserve a special keynote, and there are many a scholar to whom we would like to listen. It was instantly clear that the one topic that has been difficult to address in a transversal manner was the issue of gender. Gender, which we don't address as a separate issue in the project, but as we've seen also this morning, it comes in. It's not necessarily at the margins as we see. It's actually central to many a strategy and political program, but nevertheless, it's extremely difficult still to integrate this fully without making the claim, this is now listened to, this is now the gender part, but to have it properly integrated. So we decided that the one keynote lecture that we really want to have is on gender-related issues, on state and gender. This morning, you remember, for those of you who were here, the first panel instantly came to the question of state and nation, state and society, and this is was a beautiful introduction to what we are going to hear today. When we were clear that it is about gender, there was no discussion of whom we do want to invite, namely Professor Denise Candiotti, whose work we all have been following, whose work on gender in the Middle East and state and gender has been, from the 90s, extremely influential, having informed an entire generation of younger and not so young anymore scholars. And we were very grateful that Denise accepted our invitation, being at once a specialist both in the region, right? He has worked in various ways in supervising and being involved in the Middle East as somebody from Turkey and a Turkish scholar, but not alone. I mean, her work has also taken her to Central Asia, and I learned she even learned Russian in order to do so, so she is indeed a very dedicated and also multifaceted scholar. So it's a great privilege to have Denise here. The way we in the project, allow me to say so, give just a few words, the way we look at in the project at the issue of and the salience of gender is that in our understanding of the political and ideological processes which we are studying in the project, they are complex and seemingly contradictory and multi-layered involvement and participations of women and of issues related and relating to gender. The complexity of gender involvement emerges from, as we've also seen this today in the morning and afternoon session, emerges from a multitude of conflicting actors, the state, military forces, armed forces, civil groups, and organizations. It also emerges from the centrality of relevant societal and political areas of regulation and intervention. Again, we touched upon this: religious law and state law, personal status law, the range of social convention and practices, but also migration, education, and participation in the labor force and others. It is also manifest, last but not least, in the realm of the normative and symbolic, defining gender in terms of culture and culture wars, religion and the secular, but always bearing in mind that this realm is complex internally and far from uniform, and that there is no necessary statistical correlation between values and regulations on the one hand and practices on the other. More concretely, with regard to what the project is focused on, Iraq and Syria, the disintegration of state and society has brought about destructive forces which led to the erosion of structures, as we've been discussing today, of authority from state to religious authority to family, and the emergence of new authoritarian structures on all three levels. This erosion then in itself brings back and came back and feeds back into means of reaffirming so-called older structures. At the same time, although to a lesser extent, it has led to the withdrawal from, it has led to various forms of withdrawal, of rejection, and at times resistance. Women are directly, and we haven't really touched upon these issues, participating in warfare on either side of the front lines, caring for families and selves in so-called what we call waiting zones. This is camps in and outside of Syria and Iraq, engaging in media protests and others. Thus, victimhood and self-assertion and self-affirmation might define the spectrum of gender and women in Syria and Iraq, and by extension in the region, but would not provide a sufficient complex and critical appreciation of these realities. How to address this and how to think this, we have invited Denise Candiotti to deliver the keynote lecture for today. And as I said, and announced in the morning, we will not give another abstract of the talk, nor of the biography, but I should also thank very, very much Satani Shami, who was already in the morning with us to welcome you, who has been a steady partner with us in this project, and who, through her own work over the years, both for the Arab Council as well in her own research as an anthropologist, has really led the way to how we think in new ways and critical ways gender issues in the Middle East, and how we integrate, and this has been, as we also saw on the previous panels, extremely important, how we integrate matters related to the Middle East in a broader compass. So I'm very grateful that also Satani had agreed to be the discussant to Denise's paper, to which we are listening now.
Thank you so much. I feel deeply honored to have been asked to participate in this amazing project. And I had been struggling with how could I possibly contribute a gender angle. And then this morning I was listening to Aziz talking about, fragmentation, falling apart, etc. And the metaphor of canaries in the mine came to mind. The area of women's rights and gender act as an early warning system. The canaries in the mine cop it even before the explosion happens. And I think I will show through several examples that this is probably an apt metaphor. But let me start by pointing out that I've become a huge fan of the Financial Times, which I read religiously. And on October the 1st, 2018, an article appeared titled "Sex Violence and the Rise of Populism." That was a surprising item, given that this is not a publication that is ordinarily given to gender analysis. It commented on the militantly misogynistic tone of populist movements in the US, in Brazil, in the Philippines, in Italy, and elsewhere, providing illustrations by means of outrageous statements made by a variety of leaders, such as Rodrigo Duterte of the Philippines, Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil, Matteo Salvini in Italy, and indeed US President Trump himself. A spate of similar opinion pieces in the mainstream media suggested that the polarizing power of gender and gender debates in politics and society appears to have reached new peaks globally. While these debates were raging, I was busy trying to write a short epilogue for a volume titled Gender, Governance, and Islam, which I co-edited with two colleagues, with Nadia Al-Ali and Catherine Spellman. One of our aims was to take stock of the transformations marking the quarter of a century between the publication of Women, Islam and the State, which came out in 91, and of course this was set at a period where the fateful rearticulations between states and societies ushered in by global neoliberal transformations hadn't yet taken place, nor had the geopolitical convulsions following the 9/11 attacks on the United States in the aftermath of the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. The following tumultuous decade witnessed, as you know, popular uprisings which resulted in the overthrow of long-established authoritarian regimes in Egypt and Tunisia, while some formerly unitary states in Iraq, Syria, Libya were fragmented as a result of armed intervention and civil wars. Meanwhile, the ongoing struggles for self-determination of Palestinians and Kurds showed no sign of resolution. In short, the parameters that informed Women, Islam and the State were totally transformed. So what I will attempt to do today is to attempt to chart and make sense of the novel and contradictory ways in which the politics of gender has inserted itself into the governance of Muslim-majority countries, and how it was shaped by both geopolitical interventions and domestic struggles over identity, control, and legitimacy. To cut to the quick, I really believe that right now gender issues divide those who acquiesce to authoritarian strongman rule and men and women who recognize aspirations for gender equality and pluralism as part and parcel of a package for democratic representation. This politics, I may add, defies facile categorizations based on gender, since both men and women may find themselves on opposite ends of these divides. So to recapitulate very briefly, the central premise of WIS, for those of you who remember it, it was a long time ago, was that the post-independence trajectories of modern states in Muslim-majority countries were key to understanding the ways in which Islam inserted itself into various nation-building projects. And these nation-building projects, in turn, inflected the ways in which issues pertaining to gender and women's rights were represented both in discourse and in policy practice. My focus at the time was primarily on developmental states that included women into citizenship projects, both in their drive towards modernity and in pursuit of national development. Now, despite the authoritarian nature of post-dynastic and post-colonial regimes in the MENA region, the developmental phase of state building was meant to deliver goods and services to citizens in return for loyalty to the nation, understood as an entity that transcends the bonds of kinship, community, sect, or ethnicity. Now, wresting or attempting to wrest control of women from these subnational and highly patriarchal entities and recognizing them as citizens represented a major break, backed by policies for universal education, employment, suffrage, and social welfare. The terms of inclusion into what I broadly labeled as a state feminist compact were fairly clear. Expanding women's access to education, the labor force, and public space was principally justified in the service of the greater good, the creation of a stronger, more productive nation that enlisted enlightened, educated mothers and sisters into the national project. Nationalism, as I wrote elsewhere, was highly ambivalent about women's rights, basically. This is something that we can come. It was not a sort of glorious moment of feminism at all. Although national constitutions granting women full equality remained at odds with Sharia-derived personal status codes, the constituencies that were created and nurtured by these policies made up the backbone of the women's movements, certainly in countries like Egypt, Tunisia, and Turkey. Now, the unraveling of the post-independent social compacts from the 17th onwards, and especially after the 1980s, witnessed the descent of authoritarian states in the Arab Middle East into dynastic rule and crony capitalism. Governments, as you know, became increasingly reliant on hypertrophied security apparatuses, high level of repression, and networks based on patronage, kinship, and religion. This period also is a period that witnessed the rise of both Islamist political movements and new forms of grassroots activism, some aiming to palliate the absence of social services to the poor and the downwardly mobile, increasing, therefore, reliance on family, tribe, or regional networks as safety nets. On the other hand, state elites seeking to bolster their flagging legitimacy themselves resorted to alliances with Islamist forces, while simultaneously clamping down on tendencies they considered a political threat, and actively promoted various forms of state-sponsored religiosity. An often quoted case is what happened in Iraq when Saddam Hussein, faced with a weakening of regime controls after the losses resulting from wars and the sanctions of the 1990s, sponsored the revival of tribal federations, giving sheikhs powers and militarizing them, and also entering an official faith campaign, the Hamlet al-Iman, that reversed secularism. The immediate fallout was that honor crimes, for example, were given totally impunity and so on. In Egypt, meanwhile, as you probably all know, the encouragement of apolitical, pietistic forms of conformism, especially in the realms of gender and the family, normalized an ethos of social conservative that later made the task of ascendant Islamist parties wishing to translate this ethos into codified reality a relatively easy task. Even in Turkey, the allegedly secular military abandoned efficient secularism after the military coup of 1980 in favor of the so-called Turkish Islam synthesis, a blend of nationalism, militarism, and Sunni Islam that blossomed into a process of steady and relentless Islamization of the public sphere under a succession of AKP governments. It is, however, in fragmented post-conflict states that the lack of law and order under rival militarized factions, the absence of human security, actually hit the public presence of women most forcefully. So when you look at Zahra Ali's work, for example, on Baghdad, which she calls a city of men, you can see that public presence for women is confined to more affluent enclaves like shopping malls or private clubs. It has practically disappeared. Now, against this background, when the Arab uprisings broke out, I found myself monitoring the gender effects of these developments for a webzine called Open Democracy. After the first flush of euphoria over the apparently inclusive, pluralistic, and non-sectarian nature of the protests and the natures of their demands, what became instantly clear was the precariousness of women's rights in successor regimes, which were vying with one another to claw back existing rights. I remember being struck at the time by the fact that on his first visit to Tripoli in October 2011, National Transitional Council Chairman Mustafa Abdul Jalil declared that polygamy would be made legal, when in fact polygamy was not banned under Gaddafi, merely made subject to conditions, amid cheers and celebratory gunfire of a predominantly male crowd. Now, in a country threatening to descend into chaos, as armed groups were refusing to relinquish control over their respective fiefdoms, you might have thought this was not a priority. Now, the much commented upon spate of harassment and sexual violence that erupted during the protests in Egypt, targeting female demonstrators, also indicated that this was no spontaneous expression of misogyny, but a well-orchestrated deterrence campaign offering impunity to the perpetrators. Even in Tunisia, where the legal system appeared unscathed, It was open season for attack by Salafists in the streets and university campuses. These developments invited us to reflect on the factors conditioning the manifest fragility of gender equality platforms and women's rights. Now, many people acknowledge that we were dealing here with the effects of a long process of reconfiguration of state and society, which empowered and entrenched forces that were now best placed to capitalize on democratic openings, but unlikely to embrace ideals of inclusive democracy, least of all in the realms of gender, family, etc. Another common contention was that women's rights never achieved legitimacy at the popular level in the initially rural or tribal Muslim societies outside a thin layer of educated urbanites. For example, Sami Zubaydah argues this quite forcefully. Without the trusteeship of authoritarian modernizing leaders such as Ataturk, Bourguiba, or Nasser, or even more blatantly dictatorial leaders such as Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi, the expansions of women's rights would have no popular base and therefore no electoral appeal. Hence, what my colleague in Turkey, Yeşim Arat, calls the democratic paradox, whereby an expansion of popular participation results in the contraction of women's rights. Incidentally, this is not a post-Arab Spring phenomenon. The same thing was observed in the post-Soviet moment in Russia and in the countries of East and Central Europe. So this has a broader application. Now, while all this was being discussed, I was finding explanations revolving around the rise of Islamism and references to some primordial misogyny, actually eloquently invoked by Mona El-Tahawi. Maybe you remember her famously titled article, "Why Do They Hate Us?" in Foreign Policy. I found it was deeply unsatisfactory, actually. And therefore, I started to grapple with what it was, what influences actually were impacting on this political field. And among these were what I think are three global influences which are crucial. To make them memorable, I labeled them the ugly sisters of feminism. Okay. Now, the first global encounter was the institutionalization of standards and mechanisms for gender equality promoted through the workings of the United Nations and major international donors. Now, a conjuncture, in my view, that has facilitated the marginalization, if not outright discrediting of advocacy for gender equality in the Arab states, is the particular way in which global templates for gender justice and equality were imported and applied in the region. The global agenda for gender equality, defined by standard-setting instruments such as CEDAW, successive UN conferences and their platforms, required monitoring at the national level. This led, as you all know, to the creation of national machineries for the advancement of women and an infrastructure of donor-funded organizations and NGOs dedicated to the empowerment of women. In the Arab world, these machineries became appendages of authoritarian regimes, and the cadres involved in rights advocacy were generally part of organizations that could only flourish under state patronage. Now, although the tensions and contradictions between donor-funded apparatuses and grassroots women's movements exist everywhere. There is a huge literature on Latin America on this question. They take a particularly destructive and perverse form when the women's rights agenda is enlisted to serve as a democratic fig leaf for dictatorial regimes. So the opportunistic nature of engagement with gender equality platforms contributed to their derailment and demise after the Arab uprisings. Indeed, one of the immediate fallouts of regime change was that these cadres, and even those who were only tangentially linked to ruling circles, became tainted with the stain of collaboration with a corrupt government. This phenomenon, described wonderfully by Hoda al-Sadda, who I'm glad to say is with us today, which she calls the First Lady Syndrome, speaks eloquently of the deleterious effects of the co-optation of the women's rights agenda by a corrupt state. And you can make this example across the board. Likewise, in Tunisia, the Union Nationale de la Femme Tunisienne collapsed, and Leila Trablisi, the First Lady, fled into exile. There was nothing left. Now, what I find particularly disheartening about these developments is that the gains achieved by the painstaking efforts of women's groups and activists of all persuasions who have over several decades worked so hard to move things along have seen their achievements hijacked by the ruling circles. And this is happening now even in Turkey, where you had a very strong independent women's NGO movement. I think it was Marina Ottaway who suggested that jumping on the gender equality bandwagon is a soft option used by numerous authoritarian regimes to indicate a commitment to a democratization agenda which they are in flagrant breach of. I think that in the interests of time, I will not give examples. I mean, I will say Saudi Arabia, and that will be enough for you to let your imaginations run. The second ill-fated encounter took place after a global turn to neoliberalism since the Reagan-Thatcher era. Whereas initially many grassroots movements, including women's movements, were explicitly committed to social justice and redistributive goals, their incorporation into donor-funded machineries in the neoliberal age produced an NGOization of political movements, with women's NGOs often acting as contractors for governments and donors. This led to the de-radicalization of their objectives, now transformed into technocratic fixes for the empowerment of women, as my former PhD student Islah Jad argued in the case of NGOs in Palestine after the Oslo process and beyond. Generally speaking, I can say that in the global south, the spaces left vacant by shrinking state provision and the dearth of social welfare were occupied by actors and social movements with conservative agendas and with roots in faith-based organizations, whether these be Catholic, evangelical, or Muslim. So these populist and religious movements claiming to speak on behalf of the poor, in fact, were, despite their authoritarian and dogmatic overtones, having great appeal. And I remind you of the role of Islamic charities in Egypt, of the Muslim Brotherhood working at the mosque level, at the local community level, etc. So I believe that the drifting apart of gender justice and social justice goals had particularly grave consequences, because what happened is that it marked out women's rights as the alleged preoccupation of a privileged elite, especially in countries like Egypt, Tunisia, etc. Now, my last and most devastating encounter came with a military intervention by Western powers following the 9/11 attacks in the US and the ensuing war on terror. I believe that our conceptual horizons on questions relating to Islam and women's rights were dominated and greatly constricted by this scenario for over a decade now. The combined effects of opportunistic championing of women's rights as a justification for armed intervention, and of donor packages alleged to empower women in post-conflict reconstruction in countries such as Iraq and Afghanistan, led to probing the links between feminism and imperialism in books famously like Laila Lugod's Do Women Need Saving? Of course, this debate harks back to the colonial legacies of feminism, but it goes well beyond it. And what this did is that it triggered a veritable cottage industry of critiques of feminism and imperialism and women's rights as a tool in this broader arsenal of oppression. We must be very clear that previous radical indictments of political liberalism, secularism, and the modern state, as Western impositions and oppressive modes of governmentality, following Talal Assad's critique of secularism, as part of the apparatus of the cultural hegemony of the West, facilitated the identification of women's rights with a flawed liberal project. Now, one of the inadvertent consequences of these critiques was to delegitimize the struggles of women on the ground in Afghanistan and elsewhere when they attempted to expand their rights by whatever slender means at their disposal, whether this was with reference to international conventions or even reformist readings of Islam. You know, I mean, Islamic feminists were not spared by this critique, you know, and were tainted by the same. Now, what is very interesting here, because when you looked at the actual practices of peoples on the ground, you know, what they were doing, is that they were using both liberal human rights frameworks and diverse interpretations in Islam as malleable resources as bargaining chips with governments that were not interested in listening to them, okay? Now, to come to the closing section of what I have to say, the paradox that we ended up with is that while feminism was being increasingly discredited and dismissed in academic discourse as the handmaiden of imperialism and adjunct of overbearing security states, we were witnessing in the course of the Arab uprisings new spontaneous grassroots movements where young men and women mobilized together to mock authority, to condemn the repression of, and violence of state and non-state actors. You all well remember in Egypt how the spotlight was turned on political violence, including gender-based violence, and how this lifted the lid on the previously taboo topic of harassment, prompting the formations of networks such as Tahrir Bodyguard, Imprint, Harassment, and so on, which included young men in their ranks. Now, how do we account for this disjuncture between the ground and academic discourse? Were these indications of new sensibilities that our colleague Asaf Bayat identifies as post-Islamism? And if so, where does this leave patriarchy? Now, and here is where I come into new territory, because this is something I'm thinking about newly, so I would really appreciate your feedback. Now, although state practices are gendered everywhere, a particularly explicit connection exists in the Middle East and North African countries, regardless of their regime types, by the way, between the language of power and that of patriarchal authority. Power holders often utilize the idiom of patriarchy to legitimize their regulation of citizens' lives, to suppress dissent, and to manufacture consent. They generally enlist men to their project of rule by explicitly upholding male prerogatives over the control of women, both in law and through daily practices. The trade-off in abdicating authority to autocratic state rule, especially for men of the popular classes who are themselves subordinated in the class hierarchy, is to retain control over the domestic and communal domains, a control deemed central to the exercise of masculinity. Historically, when you look at historical examples, this compact manifested itself in cross-party and cross-class alliances among men when it came to blocking reformist moves concerning an expansion of women's rights. For instance, in Egypt, the secular Wafd party was readily joining the fray in calling for a restriction of women's rights in Egypt after the fall of Mubarak. giving the lie, actually, to the notion that Islamist parties hold a monopoly in this domain. In Turkey, likewise, a group of male MPs across political parties attempted to block the draft of a reformed civil code in 2000 on the ground that equality in the family would lead to chaos. Thus, the safeguard of male privileges, whether in the name of religion, the maintenance of social order, or the integrity of the family, can act as an important plank of populist consensus and cross-class alliances among men. And now I'm going to say something contentious. I think that it is this social contract that has long sustained cross-class and cross-party alliances among men that appeared to show unexpected cracks and fissures during the brief moments of euphoria that followed the Arab uprisings and indeed the Gezi protests in Turkey in 2013. Despite their undemocratic outcomes, I feel that the glimpses offered by this eruption of contentious politics is worth reflecting on. Now, my personal awakening was occasioned by a long-forgotten episode of the Green Movement in Iran in 2009, when Majid Tavakoli, a student leader, was arrested after delivering a fiery speech against dictatorship and was alleged by the pro-government media to have fled Iran dressed as a woman. A series of photographs showing him wearing a headscarf and chador were clearly intended to expose him as a coward and humiliate his supporters by association. This invitation to fall in line had an unexpected outcome. Men started to post pictures of themselves on Facebook wearing hijab under the caption, "We are all Majid." Their reactions embodied two simultaneous moves: ridiculing the regime's transparent and crude attempt to manipulate public opinion, while rebuffing its bid to enlist men into accepting that an association with femininity debases them. I think this is very important because I believe that this fleeting episode was the harbinger of numerous displays of new political sensibilities and inventive ways of subverting authority during the popular uprising of 2001 and certainly in the Gezi events, which I was more closely following. Now, if resistance follows and contests the terms of systems of power, it should not surprise us to find anti-patriarchal contestations and virulent reactions to them in contexts where the language of power and patriarchy are most explicitly and intimately intertwined. I remember the posters of the Gezi protests, you know, "You are not our father," the Sultan, you know, mocking, you know, Now, and here is where I get into trouble, because I am claiming that patriarchy as we know it is actually on its last leg in our region. I mean, this region, which is supposed to be the cradle of patriarchy, because I am going to now argue that the maintenance of patriarchal power becomes more onerous, increasingly onerous, when women have an apparently irreversible presence in the public domain as public employees, workers, artists, entrepreneurs, consumers, citizens. In Iran, it was an abject failure. They couldn't suppress the women's movement. The aspirations of youth have never been higher in terms of educational attainment, professional achievement, civic participation, even in families with modest means. So what I did is that I stopped using the term patriarchy, and I substituted with something I coined, but I'm very open to alternative suggestions, which I call masculinist restoration. Yes, masculinist restoration denotes a break with the past and identifies a phase when patriarchy is no longer secure and requires higher levels of coercion and the deployment or more varied ideological state apparatuses to ensure its reproduction. The Turkish state is hugely spending through the Ministry of Religious Affairs in every province, in every locality, family guidance and counseling centers, you know, to contain, okay, to actually brainwash women into accepting, you know, the new kind of state morality. Now, when you look at it from this perspective, new patterns of violence against women can no longer be, you know, understood with reference to some assumed routine functioning of patriarchy, but points to its threatened demise at a point in time when it is not securely hegemonic. Whether at state level or at the level of governance, the bid to maintain power may be reduced to its crudest coercive means, which it is in post-conflict states, which is why we see the easy, you know, escamotage of women from the public sphere. You literally have, you know, a process of fragmentation where you have a hyper-militarized, hyper-masculinized public space. So basically, we are reduced either to crude coercion or to appeals to orthodoxy in Bourdieu's sense, since the long taken for granted fabric of patriarchy and patriarchal acquiescence is frayed and punctured by daily breaches of the gender order. And the funniest is in Iran, where they hopelessly were trying to separate public transport, and it was a farce what was going on, actually. I've read a new PhD, which is absolutely wonderful on that they couldn't contain it. Now, what I'm going to conclude on, and this is very debatable, and you know, I would like to, you know, elaborate, the contradictory politics of masculinist restoration on one hand and anti-patriarchal resistance on the other open new fields of contestation for a new generation of men and women who are more fully alert to the intimate relations between authoritarian rule and forms of oppression based on gender, creed, ethnicity, or sexual orientation. And this brings me back to where I started. Remember the Financial Times article? The observation that gender orders are undergoing massive convulsions in the wake of a new global turn to strongman politics. And I think that seldom have culture wars over the family, sexual mores, and gender equality mapped more neatly onto political orientations. For those of us who have been longing to de-orientalize scholarship on gender in Muslim countries, this seems to be a particularly opportune moment to finally locate the politics of gender where it belongs, at the front lines of struggles for democracy and human rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise, for this, as usual, brilliant and very sharp lecture. And certainly, the floor is yours to come in.
Okay, thank you very much, Nadia. Thank you, Denise. It's a privilege, a true privilege for me to be put in this position of having to comment on Denise's presentation. Of course, I had read Denise before I met her, but then I met her, and then we kept meeting in rather strange places.
And she kept changing our minds.
And we kept meeting in different locations, and you know, I dare say we are friends as well as colleagues. And but she is always a mentor, and this lecture is no exception. I have learned a lot. I want to confess that I did not prepare. I did not have the text, and what I'm presenting now is really a reaction, and it's going to be messy and thinking out loud. I did not resort to what discussants often do, which is prepare something else based on either your previous work and so on. So I preferred, in the spirit of...
We are grateful for this, Maria.
In the spirit of the conference, the spirit of the session, to react to what I heard and to invite discussion. Denise's work, her lectures, and her writings are always tightly woven. So, perfectly structured. So we came back at the end to the beginning. And what I'm going to do, probably what I can do, is highlight some things that you have already said and comment a bit on them and open it up for more discussion. So I'll start with the idea that perhaps like any topic, but particularly on the topic of women and gender, every time we felt that we were reaching somewhere in the literature in terms of unpacking this very difficult and complex set of issues, the circumstances changed. And so it was always a moving target. So you would feel with the literature that you're beginning to, whether on the region or globally or on any particular aspect of these issues, you would feel you were getting somewhere, and then the context changes, and all of a sudden our old concepts no longer work. And I think this is the theme running through your presentation. So I particularly very much appreciated the kind of chronology, kind of intellectual genealogy that you presented us. And the ways in which certain things and certain ways of thinking about gender can continue to be productive, but certain ways have reached some sort of dead end, and we have to give them up and move on. Okay, and this is not only the other sort of aspect that came through very powerfully for me is how academic discourse is not separate from development projects, development discourse, state discourse, political discourse, but they're all intertwined. And this is what makes, in fact, the issues, the stakes very high, and the resistance to hegemonic ways of thinking about gender and gender identities and gender roles very, very difficult, because in fact there's collusion and complicity at a certain level, and there's less, and there's more fragmentation at the level of resistance and at the level of trying to come up with alternative ways of doing things. And so these three challenges or ugly sisters that you talked about, I think, is the core of what you're presenting to us, and I think all of us can recognize our own work and our own lives in these three ways of thinking about gender and talking about gender and working on gender. The gender equality sort of moment with the UN and NGOs and so on, which the First Lady syndrome and so on, with the efforts being hijacked by regimes. This is the first moment you talked about, and then the second moment is that of neoliberalism and NGOization. And I just wanted to comment in general that so far we have not talked about in the panels so far. So this talk is bringing an important aspect of the whole set of issues that we're dealing with, which is this so-called civil society, so-called civic space, and NGOs and so on, and what role they have in the evolution and devolution of centers and margins and so on. So I think that's an issue we could pursue more in the discussion. And then the third moment of military intervention, war on terror. Do women need saving? Which, as you mentioned, harkens back to colonial discourses, but at a very different global moment, and which we could discuss more, has disrupted, in fact, feminism globally.
Oh, yes.
And has caused all sorts of fissures and fractions among women's movements as to how do white women save brown women from brown men. This has become an issue which has really divided feminist movements globally, and so our region has played a role in this, for good or for bad. So these 3 moments we could talk much, much more about, and to think about how they unfolded in different places and in different settings. But all of them do sort of come together to leave us at something of an impasse. And where do we go from here? And you offered us some clues as to how we can go from here to a set of new debates and new struggles and new action. I would love to hear more about the differences between patriarchy and masculinist restoration, as you call it, because I wasn't sure, perhaps I misheard, but that in a way opposing those 2 things or putting them as two sides of a coin, or and I mean, I think I would rather think of them as 2 sides of a coin rather than as a phase that's over and a new phase that's starting, because patriarchy, obviously, like any other structure, is constantly reinvented and constantly being reproduced, and so it's not a thing. And so, you know, how is masculine restoration, what you call that, how is it different from just another face of patriarchy or another reinvention of patriarchy or a reproduction of patriarchy? I do very much appreciate and take seriously and invite everyone to take seriously this idea of new forms of action and perception that are emerging through struggle and through contestation and through resistance. I think this is a challenge across all the topics and fields and so on that we are dealing with. What I alluded to just briefly in my introduction this morning, saying we need new concepts, we need new ways of thinking, and we need ways of theorizing from the street. And we have not been very good at theorizing from the street or what's happening in the street, or the street as a metaphor. I mean, not literally the street, but, and I think the street has been crying out for new ways of interpretation and new ways of analysis, and the response has been rather weak from the academic end of things. So yes, I think we're in front of a huge challenge, and this brings me then to, you know, what Nadia was said at the beginning and laid out at the beginning, that we don't think of gender as, you know, this topic that we add on. It's not something that we just address after we have addressed other issues. And in fact, gender is analytically many things. It's a cross-cutting theme. As you said, it's a transversal issue that cuts across all of these things. But also, gender is a lens, and that's a different way of thinking about it. Gender is a lens through which you can see all of the topics and themes and so on. All these issues that we're discussing about state structures, economic structures, markets, political systems, tribes, are gendered. Tribes are very gendered. All of these topics that we've been discussing about are gendered, and looking at them through the lens of gender, the construction of masculinities and femininities, is a lens to understand. It's one lens among many. So that's a rather different way of thinking about gender than thinking about it as a cross-cutting theme. But I would say what we don't want to do, and I think this is what Denise was also saying, we don't want to think about gender as a sector, as a sector of, you know, particular, with its own concepts, with its own frames, with its own NGOs, with its own institutions, and so on. And so we're looking for a sensibility, an analytical sensibility. You use the word sensibility, yes. I like that. But it's a very challenging one. It's a very difficult one. And yes. Okay, one other issue that I was thinking about listening to you, and you referred to it a little bit towards the end, is this eternal distinction between the domestic and the public. I'm not saying private and public, I'm saying domestic and public. And the way in which the domestic itself is getting exploded and is getting fragmented. You alluded to this. I think this is very important and very much part and parcel of what we are discussing and the implications of this. This is somehow related. I can't make a neat segue, but it's related somehow to this idea of women, of men subverting gender perceptions or stereotypes and so on. And the example you give from Iran of men dressing up as women in order to make a protest about the politics, a certain political framing of issues. And I wonder, I think we need to think about that more as well and what it is saying. Is it an emasculation of men, which makes them dress up as women? Is it a statement about emasculation? Or is it about a post-gender kind of politics? I don't know. I don't know how quite to think about it. Is it the usual and stereotypical way in which youth and women are always put together? So are these young men who are saying we as young men are, like women, powerless like women? Is it that we are, we are men who have been emasculated, therefore we've become like women? Or is it really a post-male, post-female genuine solidarity between men and women, which we would like to think it is? But I think the other possibilities are also there. I think this is all I can. Yes, to repeat that I really, personally, I'm always very interested in these kinds of intellectual genealogy and this reflection on your writings 25 years later. I mean, this is very important, and I feel, because, at the Arab Council for Social Sciences, we receive a lot of proposals. We're a funding agency, basically. We give out grants and fellowships and so on, so we receive a lot of proposals. And I don't know how it is in Turkey, but definitely in the Arab region, there's too little reference to work that has taken place in the past. These proposals are often, whatever the topic, gender, urban, climate change, anything, environment, anything that you can refer to, always every project is presented as being new and as being the first and so on and so forth. And really this building on past work is so important to be done. And yet, at the same time, we are in some kind of, you're suggesting, we are in a kind of post phase, post something, so we need to identify what this new stage, era, post is, but let's build on what we know and what has been done in the past, because I think all those three moments exist at the same time. You still have the state discourse about, women in the public space. You still have the NGO activities. You still have all the women need saving. You have all of these happening at the same time, and so we can't forget the intellectual genealogies of each of these analytical moments. I'll stop here. I may have, perhaps towards the end of the session, have some more things to say.
For this very alert, important comments, and I would suggest, because it was really very much in response to what Denise had laid out, as you said, in a very compact and I think very convincing fashion. Maybe you want to respond to Setini with a few words, because I saw you.
There is $1 million question in there, which is what is the difference between patriarchy and masculinist restoration? That's the.
Sorry, so we need to have the.
Yeah.
We need to speak
I
to
thought
the
it was on. Oh,
sorry.
What is the difference between patriarchy and masculinist restoration? I have to say that my definition of patriarchy is very strict. It's not sort of woolly, stereotypes, etc. It is also very materialistic, because, patriarchy in its classic unchallenged form is a form where older men are also in power over the younger. So the first crumbling of patriarchy occurs when authority relations among men crumble. So, rural patriarchy in Turkey took knocks when young men went to Germany and they didn't need the father's animals or money to marry the brides they wanted. They may defer to their elders, but they were independent. That was the first blow. And of course, that kind of emancipation carries women with them. If you think of the types of, I'm very interested in cross-gender alliances. At what moments in history are there cross-gender alliances? Certainly at the turn of the century, with the first wave of Arab feminism, notice that in Turkey, in Egypt, it was men who were, demanding love matches, wanting to eliminate, the separation of men and women, because they didn't want to be controlled by their mothers and their aunties. It wasn't just the father, and they had to carry the women with them, okay? And there's quite a lot of work on that. And it was the same with veiling. It was a new urban bourgeois class that wanted a different kind of familial relation, which was breaking, with the previous forms of authority, which in Turkey was also the break with the ultimate patriarch, the Sultan. So it was regime change, both in the family, and there's a lot written on Turkey about that. I think we are now in a new phase, after the neoliberal transformations, the material bases of male authority have crumbled. I mean, if you look at, the famous Quranic, what makes men superior over women is that they spend of their wealth. Gone, finished, evaporated. I mean, the number of women who have to fend for themselves. Certainly in Turkey, males are unemployed, women are working all hours, That's the situation. So what then do you do? How then do you have access to authority? You have a phenomenal increase in domestic violence. It goes over the roof. 14-fold, it increases. So the women who are being battered are those who refuse to be subordinated. When you look at the newspaper articles, girls who refuse to marry the guys the fathers want, women who dare to divorce their husbands, after they divorce, they go back and kill them, okay? Now, I think that, of course, what we have here is definitely something that is post. Racism today is post-civil rights racism. Misogyny today is post-Me Too misogyny. So it has to be much more virulent. And when you look at men's movements, actually, I marvel at Egypt, frankly. They make a huge, tiny little change to the laws, the Hul law, which, if you ask me, is hugely unfair to women. You have to bankrupt yourself to divorce a guy. What happens next? Men's groups form in Egypt to say women are oppressing us. We have to, protect our rights, Now, this type of movement cannot be assimilated to what I call patriarchy as usual. The business of usual of patriarchy was based in a different context. What makes this post is that this comes, okay, shall I be very kind of crude and cliche? If the 20th century was the century of emancipatory struggles, when disadvantaged groups were able to get some rights, the 21st century is the century of putting them in their place. And that includes women, that includes blacks, that includes, people of lower caste, etc. So all the movements that you see, from Modi's India, look at all these movements. What are they doing? They are trying to forcefully reinstate hierarchies that have been crumbling, actually. And this is where I come to the even more important question Setania asked me, what do men's movements mean when they dress like women and start going around? There was this fascinating movement in Turkey of a group of men saying, "We are not men." That was there. And they went around in dresses, skirts, etc., with pancards. If being a man is beating women, then we are not men. If being a man is, domestic violence, then we're not men. And of course, what happened is that Erdogan lambasted them, saying, "You are not men. Who the hell are you?" Okay, and so on. So I think that there is a moment now where some constituencies among men, and they tend to be younger men, although I wouldn't like to generalize, have suddenly cottoned on to the fact that there will be no patriarchal dividend of an authoritarian regime for them. What I mean by the patriarchal dividend, it's a term coined by Bob Connell, who, when he was talking about, male dominance, said that even men who in their personal lives do not necessarily subscribe to inegalitarian, practices, and who may be quite liberal, benefit from a patriarchal dividend because of their categorical belonging to the category of men, okay? Now, of course, when you start getting subordinated masculinities, as in the gay movement, when you start getting the whole gender thing being opened to, then it becomes very complicated. All this means, basically, to answer Setani, is that what looks like patriarchy recreating itself, it never recreates itself as the same thing. That's the whole thing. That's the whole point. And so in this moment, I'm making a bold statement that this is maybe a moment where cross-gender alliances can actually define political camps, that it is no longer about men versus women, but it is about political orientations. So it's not about empowering women by training them. It's about making political alliances. It's about deciding, whether the subordination of women is an attractive political choice for men. And I remember, can I tell you an anecdote? The moment of my greatest humiliation, I was giving a talk in The Hague, in Holland. And I was giving something along the same lines, saying, well, look at Iran, I'm sure there are lots of men who are against this. In fact, I was interviewing Shirin Ebadi, who said to me that she had loads of male clients who are participating in women's demonstrations, ended up in jail. And a young man raised his hand. And he said, Professor Candiot, you're so naive, he said. And I said, why? And he said, look, a lot of these guys, who went to Canada and the United States as exiles, big lefties, you know what they did after the Iranian Revolution? They went back to take a second wife. And do you know what happened when I went back home, to visit my family? We were going to visit, I don't know what shrine, and he had a sister. And the little 8-year-old boy turned to her and said, you can't come with us, you are unclean. I guess she was menstruating, how he knew about it, I don't know. And he said, before, a statement like that would have followed by a slap in the face. Where did he get, the gumption to talk like that, okay? And I had to absorb that, but that was a long time ago, okay? That was a long time. I had to absorb that and felt, oh my God, does masculine privilege override everything? Even, cashing in on the benefits of a theocratic regime? Come on. Personally, I believe that your children, I see a lot of female friends, a lot of feminist friends, and I'm making the bold assertion that your children don't buy into that. And certainly, I'm so gratified to see so many young people, it's in this session. Certainly, a group of youth doesn't buy into that. A group of Islamist youth in Turkey, male and female, think it's completely uncool. Completely uncool. So, I rest my case.
Thank you. We open, I see hands eager to come up, and the first I saw was Basma, in the first row here with the orange, yes, and then the lady behind her, I don't know your name.
Thank you, Denise, for a very inspiring presentation. And it takes us to ask so many questions, but I'll just limit them to two. One of them is what perhaps you touched upon just now in your last words, was about strategies, strategies for women. And you said it is about deciding on political orientation and what kinds of coalitions, who are the allies, what should that strategy be. I remember hearing young and older women here in Lebanon having a very fiery discussion about the younger one contesting the polite and reformist nature of the old generation's strategy of basically asking men to concede and rejoicing when there was a slight change in a law or something that was, and the younger women were saying, that's done, we're done, you lost too much time, it never really happened. So I would love to hear from you more if you have something to say about strategies. The second point is you beautifully outlined these different stages when with the last one you mentioned was the populist movements and how it was impacting feminism. I would want to think with you or encourage you to also react to this maybe other situation is when a state is in deep crisis or it is collapsing, when we are in a situation of conflict, power is basically up for grabs and the center is up for grabs, while there is disorder that prevails in the social sphere. And what we have seen in Iraq, certainly in Libya as well, and Yemen, and in Syria largely as well, is that the women are failing to break through the political sphere due to the violence, actually, because it does reinforce the masculinist restoration that you talked about, and also because but in parallel, and here is the paradox, it is what you also described, the increase of women's agency in the social sphere, which is also resulting from the conflict. But there is not a glass ceiling, but a real ceiling up there that seems to have prevented women from making it into the political sphere, because it seems that the men have in fact renewed the materialist base of their masculinity through conflict, through the violence. So I wanted to hear you on those 2 points. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And since it is a complex question, let's take them one by one. Yeah, if you agree. And then
strategies. Very complicated because you see, it depends how broad a coalition you're aiming for, you know. And one of the things that creates a real difficulty is what you do about sexual liberties platforms, okay? Because I was in a meeting in Turkey, I remember very distinctly, where there were some men who were not only in the gay movement, but some of them actually were you know, fighting for the rights of prostitutes, of these male prostitutes. And I found myself saying that if we include you, let me tell you who we will be losing. Okay? I could make a list because there were a number of women who identified as Islamic who were quite happy to go along a broad agenda of women's rights, but only stopped at sexual liberties. What do you do with them? That's number one. Number two, how do you form coalitions across genders? This is a huge challenge. I think, frankly, that it's up to men, actually, to organize themselves. It's not, you know, the task of women to be conscientizing everybody. I think that, you know, it's up to men to sit down together and say, are we, you know, are we getting anywhere with this kind of agenda of, but this is why I agree completely with Basma that the ultimate masculinist restoration is militarization, because it eliminates the bases on which women could be empowered by being in the public sphere, etc. It makes them all over again wards of their families. They can't step outside their neighborhoods. It is the most regressive thing in the world. Empowerment, I'm not so sure, because, you know, they have to fend for themselves quite often. lots of widows, lots of disabled men, you know, lots of that. But there is no way it will convert into political power unless there is a movement in the country itself, an opposition movement. So the question then is, how can an opposition, a democratic opposition movement, constitutes itself by placing gender at its center? Oh dear, yes, I'm sorry. I'm also losing my voice. I think, you know, this is the great difficulty. How do you, instead of seeing gender as a byproduct, take it as a litmus test? So people who have qualifiers, you know, democracy but Islamic democracy, Christian democracy. And the next sentence is you have to limit women's rights. How do you get out of that? I don't know. The answer is I don't know.
Thank you. Let's see how the questions go, because I have a list developing, but let's start with you first.
Okay, so I'll be quick. So I'm speaking here from a position of the lawyer. My name is Lama Abaode. So there is something really odd about the sort of patriarchy is destroying itself triumphalism of your speech, because if you look at the forms of legal reforms we're going through in the Arab world, they're really equivalent to second wave feminist legal reforms. Literally, we are battling at the level of sexual difference here. To remove segregation, to undo the Jane Crow system. We're battling, you know, we're talking about sameness. Do not treat women differently from men at the level of the 70s feminist discourse when it comes to law, okay? The other point that I want to make is there's a huge ambiguity in your presentation between three different things that you seem to be equating. So on the one hand, you're saying, oh, patriarchy is collapsing because of the collapse of its political power. Take one. Take two, patriarchy is collapsing as a result of a kind of a generational turnover. You know, things change, middle classes start to redefine themselves when it comes to gender. There's a form of liberalization, yay. And then there is the idea that it is social opposition or activism that is causing this patriarchy to implode. And it's never clear which one you're saying. If you're saying it's social activism that's making patriarchy implode, that's a very odd statement given the weakness of social opposition, because that's exactly what we learned from the Arab Spring.
Yeah, I know.
The masses went out on the streets, but it turns out that they were too weak of a force to make any form of transformation. But you seem to be suggesting that there's somehow they were powerful enough to undo patriarchy. And just very quickly, the third thing, when you make a distinction between social justice and feminism and the NGO world, I think that's too much of a sharp bifurcation of two sides that are constantly conversing with each other. Feminist activists have always been weak within left organizations, and they have had to lean into the NGO universe in order to get the support that they have lacked within the left. And so they sit somewhere in between. And the NGO sector, if you go to their meetings, we have to congratulate them for allowing female representation in a way that it has no equivalent anywhere in Arab society, not in bureaucracy, not in the public, not in the so they also did quite a bit of things. I'm sorry.
Can I answer immediately before I forget?
Absolutely.
First, let me immediately correct a misconception. I'm not triumphalist, and I'm not suggesting that patriarchy is imploding. I'm suggesting that it is turning into something much nastier. And the reason it's turning into something much nastier is because it comes on the heels of struggles which now need to be reversed. Okay? In other words, when I was saying racism post-civil rights is a different kind of racism. Misogyny post-feminist movements is a different kind of misogyny. So far from being triumphalist, I'm suggesting that this is a very nasty moment, and the restoration is taking very vicious forms, using the state, using the law, using every means at the disposal of authoritarian regimes. But what I am saying, and maybe I'm wrong, is that the opposition to those authoritarian regimes has a glimmer of realization that gender issues may not be incidental to this struggle, okay? That there is a deeper realization, maybe, that, you know, taking a stand on pluralism and democratic representation as a citizen has to go through gender issues. As for the NGO sector, of course, to the extent that women were excluded from political representation, I worked in the post-Soviet countries for many reasons. The NGO sector had become a female sector, practically. They literally crowded into the NGO sector because there was no one, there was also a displaced elite phenomenon, you know, people who had lost their jobs in universities here and there, very highly cultured women, etc., started running their own NGOs. Whether this was a triumph or of an adaptation of necessity, we can discuss about that. What the impact has been on the political level, well, I don't know, we can discuss that. I don't come from a law background. What I do know is that law has now become a battleground. Certainly it is in Turkey, definitely, because what's happened is that in the 2000s, 2000, 2004, there was a quasi-revolutionary civil code reform, which was in full compliance with CEDAW, and a criminal law in 2004, which is without parallel anywhere in this region. And ever since, they've been clawing back on that, bit by bit by bit. This is what the authorities have been doing. So please don't imagine for a minute that I'm not aware of that. But I'm making a distinction between different kinds of male dominance, okay? Patriarchy, which was the term we used to, I called it sometimes classic patriarchy before. In fact, you know, I wrote a paper in '88 called Bargaining with Patriarchy, where so many of my colleagues became so attached to the concept that when I decided to junk it in Istanbul, I almost had a riot on my hands, you know? So basically, I am not triumphalist. I'm deeply worried. We are in a very dangerous moment, actually.
You gave contradictory tones about
Well, I tried to end up on an optimistic note.
Yeah. So, a paradox of the, sorry, please, yes. I think you need a micro so that they can translate.
Thank you so much for this thought-provoking talk. 2 points. First, should we also problematize a concept like gender equality? Taking into account now the major debate worldwide, including in the Arab world. For instance, Nancy Fraser criticism of meritocracy, and we need, the demand often is for urban women and without distributive justice included in thinking about gender equality, or to think about the role of the individual. For instance, the debate now in Tunisia is about the place and the status of the individual versus community and nation state. So it's extremely important. Debate is not anymore. It's a debate between conservative and liberal, but liberal is not secular necessarily, and conservative is not necessarily Islamist. So, the gender equality as a universal imaginary. I mean, as imaginary and not as a concept to be exported from place to place. If we thought about it, it needs a lot of problematization nowadays. So how would you problematize it? And I will finish here with the second point, that Sami Zubaydah maybe is right about connecting between some breakthrough on gender equality and authoritarianism historically. but it's not anymore correct nowadays. I mean, Tunisia, the debate about gender equality inheritance, it's amazingly make me optimistic like you. For instance, that and it's not it's interesting that the two government Islamist-backed government, I mean Tunisia and Morocco, they have the best, the best, not what we hope to have, personal status law. So there is things is moving toward thinking that a democratic public sphere may maybe empower the woman beyond the individualization.
Thank you.
Shall we collect now
Okay.
a few? Yeah. Please, it's, can you give a micro, please, to next to Huda's way?
Thank you. It was really very interesting to hear you, very informative and added to our knowledge quite a bit. When when we talk about gender issues, I believe that we should target the public policies in, especially in the Arab world. And these public policies, what can we do as people in the community to improve, to develop our community? Because our communities are very, to say it mildly, undeveloped, and what shall we do to develop? If we want to keep speaking about gender issues, you know, when our community is developed, gender issues will solve all the problems. Development.
And maybe we take one search, the gentleman, you had your hand up.
Thank you very much for a very informative and useful talk. This is really a comment, but I'm going to phrase it as a question. Would you not agree that it might be extremely useful to extend the very valuable overview that you presented by taking a deeper and a closer look at local community and refugee community situations, because they offer different dynamics in some ways. Thank you so much.
You want to take this?
Yes.
Yeah.
The problematic nature of gender equality, of course, there is the classic, you know, the classic liberal critique that, you know, when you're giving individual rights, you're assuming that, you know, rights in law will translate. I mean, that is the kind of Nancy Fraser argument. But I think the argument that is more powerful at the moment is the argument of replacing the concept of gender equality, which is the Islamist alternative in Turkey, for example, with gender complementarity. That argument goes that full gender equality, like equal rights for equal pay or et cetera, is actually oppressive of women because of their roles as nurturers, mothers, etc. So that what you must do is assist them in the roles that they do best. So in social policy terms, you put your effort not in providing nurseries, which they have eliminated now. Public nurseries don't exist. You know, they had the slogan, those who send their children to the nursery end up in care homes. You get the message. So trying to, yes, I mean, I could, you know, it's a translation from Turkish. So there is the battle between this idea that somehow women are equal but complementary. Remember that? I mean, it's a sort of apartheid system, you know, that they have specific rights because of their specific needs. So therefore, they get huge maternity benefits. But you see, they couldn't make it work because women needed to work. They didn't have enough money. So they started paying grandmothers. You know, the municipalities and states started giving grandmothers a stipend to take care of the children of women. Now, I don't know the detail of what is happening in Tunisia and Morocco. It is clear that, you know, they have been making progress in personal status codes, but how this translates, you know, because there are actual contradictions going on, okay? On the one hand, there is the will to define women's proper mission in society. What is their role? At one extreme, you have the very kind of biologistic, God-given biology is destiny argument, which is the fitrat argument. Turkey has, you know, huge literature on that. I checked with my Islamic feminist friends in Iran and Egypt, and apparently, you know, this is a concept which comes very late. I mean, I'm not saying it right. Fitra? Yeah, okay, that's in Arabic. So Turkey was awash with this discourse that you can't have gender equality in the liberal sense because of fitra. And what is fitra? It's, you know, people finding they're getting assistance to do what they do best, okay? And I'm sorry to say, I don't know how it works in Morocco and Tunisia, that this is part of the package that the Islamist parties in Turkey have been offering. And they have been setting up their own NGOs, and there is now a gongo, you know, with something called the family, what is it? It's an umbrella for a bunch of NGOs that work on strengthening the family, okay? My range of empirical examples of Islamist governments actually actively working to expand the rights of women's access to the public sphere by giving them, in public policy, the means to work, the means. I have to be convinced by a sufficient number of empirical examples that this is a model. This is not a model which I have seen in my own work in the places where I have worked, okay? And a lot of women, actually, are very happy with that, because now it's a huge welfare contribution to the family budget, you know? Women being paid to sit at home, grandmothers accessing welfare to take care of grandchildren, you know? The problem is that this version isn't sticking. It's becoming very expensive because the sociological realities are changing. So I think that instead of looking at gender equality as a kind of abstract concept, we have to look at how it is being implemented through concrete social policies in concrete contexts, okay? And at the point when I have sufficient empirical evidence that there are a lot of Islamic parties who are invested not in complementarity and backing up women's traditional roles, but actually leveling the playing field, as we call it, then I will be very open to consider these. It's just I haven't come across it in my own work. So that's the first question. The question of public policy. The trouble is, you see, that the era of, you know, reaching citizens through public policy has pretty much collapsed in most of this region. I mean, when you look at the post-conflict states and so on, this has frayed terribly, you know? So in a sense, there is a kind of going back. Now, Egypt tried all sorts of experiments, you know, for widows, cash transfers, etc. But it is a country where women are not even registered to vote sometimes, okay? So I think that, you know, the very fact that we are invoking public policy presupposes a particular type of polity which has been collapsing, you know? I think that probably the only place where you have affirmative social policies to keep women at home and so on is Turkey, but it's very expensive. I don't think they can disburse, you know, and keep it up. You really need a budget for that, you know? And I don't think, you know, it's going to happen. What refugees teach us? Unfortunately, this is an area I haven't worked on. I'm sure that, you know, it throws up all kinds of unexpected, you know, forms, dislocated families. The very little I know about family dislocation, well, with a disastrous, say, economic collapse, is when I was working in the post-Soviet context, where you had a 16-year-old girl who knows English making more money than her gynecologist's father, so that all the hierarchies within the family, within the community, are turned upside down, the same in Afghanistan. But of course, you know, what are going to be the permanent effects of these dislocations? What can we derive from it? We need to look at it. Many people are, to be fair. I think that there is a big literature on that. I just don't happen to be an expert in that field, you know. Yeah.
So I see one more hand, and if somebody else wants another question, please raise your hand quickly. Otherwise, Aziz, you wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, thank you. It's not a question, actually. It's simply an item of information to complement this last exchange with respect to Tunisia and Morocco. The reform of the personal status law in Morocco was a sovereign decision of the Royal Court against the sentiments, advice, and declared positions of the Islamist parties and indeed of the official religious establishment. So it has nothing to do really with an atmosphere of freedom. In Tunisia, it's a decision arrived at as a result of political bargaining, which almost split the Nahda party at that particular point in time, as it was making a transition which had been declared as marking the distinction that they wish to make between da'wah, that is to say religious propagation, and political practice on the other. So it stands to reason in that particular context.
Thank you, because I'm not...
I mean, I don't say. So this is obviously in the location what we see. I mean, and what also Satani was mentioned in her remarks. It is a lens through which to see developments, but it doesn't mean that we see everywhere necessarily the same developments. But it does help us at the same time, and in that sense, I found this discussion very fruitful to see similarities and similar developments that are larger than the regional ones that you would not necessarily see, that you would try to locate in traditional genealogies to earlier movements, and where we don't see, where really we started this morning with the question of continuity and rupture in one of the papers, right? And it's precisely this kind of question that you raise, where we see where the novelty of certain developments are, which are, of course, functioning in structures that are older than everything is new. But in that sense, I find really your term very productive of the masculine restoration, because it is really something that allows us to combine and to compare developments that use gender in the same way as you have been describing. I know that this is not the end of the debate, and that what we intend with the project to do with this issue, but I see it has been a long day and people are nervous to get some air and still maybe some daylight. I don't know whether there's still daylight no longer at this time of the day. I thank you very much. First of all, our speaker and commentator, a very warm round of applause. For those of you who want to know more about the devolution of authority, we continue with, not with the devolution, but with making sense of the evolution of authority tomorrow morning again early at 9 o'clock. Those who are more interested in a discussion format, we have at, is it 5 o'clock? At 5 o'clock, the debate, not debate, the discussion. But there may be a debate. We shouldn't be too friendly all the time with each other, but we can also exchange arguments. That is at 5 o'clock. And otherwise, I wish you a nice evening and see at least the participants tomorrow. And I'm asked to make one announcement to the participants of the conference that we